Hello and welcome to our Week 6 overview lecture. We're now entering a new theme, our politics theme. We have almost reached the halfway point in the course. We've looked at classical foundational texts, and then we've spent a couple of weeks looking at more recent debates in science. These weeks have posed the question about modernity and its meaning, about what it means to think that we might have progress, or whether progress is going to be possible, what it means to talk about reason and rationality. And then in the very most recent week of science, we were discussing people not only arguing about science and its social role and the forms of thought that characterize science, but we were also beginning to pivot around to politics, which is going to be what we're going to be looking at for the next few weeks. In our political systems theme, we'll examine new forms of political movements that arise in the 20th and 21st centuries. We'll look at reconfigurations of classical liberalism and classical conservatism, and we'll pick up on some of the themes that our previous weeks have left for us. We'll continue to look at the issue of what it means to be modern and what characterizes a modern state or a modern governmental system. We'll continue to look at the question of what is legitimate power and authority and how that relates to legitimate knowledge and truth. Many of our texts from last week were worried that the way that we think about science and knowledge and authority had political implications, and quite a few of the texts were bringing up the issue really from all different sides, accusing all of the others of possibly making people more vulnerable to bad forms of political movements, in particular to fascist political movements. So we're going to back up this week and take a look at some analyses of the actual fascist movements, also of Stalinist communism, and also of debates around what happens to democracy when you get your extension of the franchise, you get many, many more people incorporated into the state. Does this change anything about the presuppositions of liberalism, which is a system that is geared to protect minorities from majority rule? And we're also going to take a look at what happens with successful post-colonial movements that assert themselves often as nationalist movements for self-governance after the departure of empire. What some of the characteristics of these nationalist movements are, what some of their strengths and weaknesses are. So that's what we're going to be looking at over this week, and then we'll continue to look at political systems moving forward from here. So in our current work, we're looking at 20th century political movements, and some of our texts are quite recent, some of them are older. I've done supplemental lectures on the more complicated texts and some of the older texts. Some of them are very straightforward, and so I'll leave you to read those on your own if you select those. There are 3 topics this week. So for the last few weeks we've had 2 topics and you've picked a reading from each. Now we have 3 topics, and so you'll pick 3 readings, 1 from each topic. A lot of the readings are a bit shorter than they have been in past weeks, although we still do have some long ones. The general pattern is that shorter texts are more theoretically dense and longer texts are more empirical. And so the empirical stuff's often a little bit easier to read, but it takes longer to say. The shorter theoretical texts can be a bit more difficult to read because they may be covering more complex concepts, but I've tried to back up the most difficult ones with supplemental lectures so that you've got a bit of a support structure. Our topics this week are the rise of nationalist movements, democracy and mass society, and totalitarianism. And so you'll want to pick 1 reading in relation to each of those topics. So in terms of our first topic, After Empire, the Rise of Nationalist Movements is the title we've given to it. You've got several choices here. Benedict Anderson is the classical text. It's the thing that you're most likely to run into referenced in other courses. He's got a concept of imagined communities and nations and nationness as an imagined community, by which he means you don't know everybody on an immediate face-to-face level, but you have a sense of yourself as being in communion in some way with the other people in your nation. Everyone is presumed to have a nationality as though it were a natural characteristic. And he's going to analyze what the character of that imagined community is in the reading selections that we've got today. They're taken from different portions of a longer book that he's written. And they'll focus particularly on the way in which several different historical factors combined across the 18th and 19th centuries to shape our sense of what a nation is. He talks about things like the decline of religion and the move to the nation as a sort of secularized sacred space where people can find meaning in something bigger than themselves. And he also talks about something he calls print capitalism, which isn't a concept that originates with him, but about the drive to create markets in national literatures where those are vernacular literatures. And so you start getting an identification of other people who speak the same language, and factors like that. Another selection in this topic is Frantz Fanon, writing on the difficulties faced by anti-colonial movements that successfully gain independence. They often form themselves as nationalist movements in the process. The great revolutionary hope with these movements is that once the colonial powers are gone and people are governing themselves, they'll be able to develop and make quite rapid progress. And Fanon is writing at a point where it is clear in some spaces that the hoped-for rapid progress isn't happening. And he is analyzing very, very critically what goes wrong in some of these post-colonial nationalist movements that keeps them from progressing. Partha Chatterjee is a critical response to Benedict Anderson, asking the question, who is doing the imagining for the imagined communities of the nation? And the concern here is the way in which colonial administrations interfere with the concept of nationhood and common culture and the rest that might have developed if the colonial administration hadn't been in place. Ernst Gellner, alongside Anderson, is making an argument that we tend to think about the nation as though it's something very traditional and very old and sort of grounded in history, but in fact nations are quite recent things, and nationalism is particularly recent. And Gellner is going to analyze the relationship between the development of a new division of labor associated with industrial society that concentrates people and moves people around in different ways, and the rise of nationalism. And then the Hugh Trevor Roper piece is a bit long, but it's quite fun. It's an analysis of Highland traditions in Scotland that again are perceived to be quite old. They're perceived to be something that people have inherited. And this is an analysis of how and when these traditions were invented that argues that actually they're pretty new. And it has a sort of funny elements of a story to illustrate the basic point that you've got this perception of the ageless culture that gathers itself together into a nation, but in fact these are practices that consolidate quite quickly in fairly recent history. The second topic is on democracy and mass society, and in this topic the readings are quite different from each other. You'll get a very different perspective depending on which you pick. So Hobhouse is a text that we almost could have read back when we looked at classical liberalism. He's running just a bit too late for that. It's also something that we could look at again next week when we're going to look at transformations within liberalism and conservatism as we move forward in time. But it is a restatement of classical liberal positions, but it is written in light of demands posed by new kinds of social movements, and so the sorts of liberty that it outlines, it provides a categorization of different kinds of liberty, include things that address some of the demands of working class movements, women's movements, racial and ethnic movements. It has an awareness of a broader range of demands and is trying to wrestle with what that means within a classical liberal framework. Walter Lippmann is making a critique, and often a very sarcastic and very funny critique, of various arguments that it is necessary or even possible for ordinary citizens to follow political affairs as well as specialists. So he's pushing on the issue of what it means that we are in a mass democratic society where large numbers of people are sovereign, are part of the sovereign, they make decisions to govern themselves. And he talks about the way in which various educational texts presuppose that people are going to be studying and informing themselves about this huge range of issues that you would need to know if you were going to really function as the sovereign. And he's basically making fun of it, all the different things that you need to do, and asking about the realism of it, given that people have other things to do with their time. And the overall tenor of the argument is that it's really nothing to worry about if people basically trust specialized bodies, politicians, journalists, other sorts of figures, to follow the political stuff for them, and don't, in fact, devote this huge portion of their life to public affairs. It's an argument that that's okay. Ortega y Gasset is analyzing the rise of mass society, and mass society is one of these categories that pops up in many of our readings this week and will come up occasionally in future texts as well, but it's a major preoccupation in the early to mid 20th century. There is a real concern. You've had a significant expansion of the franchise. You have the movement of populations into a new division of labor based on centralized industrial production. You get mass movements that are predicated on these new populations that have been reassembled into new locations. And there's a great deal of fear about what it means that the mass is more central, and this fear is accentuated by the rise of mass political movements like fascism and like certain forms of communist or socialist politics that seem like they will tear apart the conventions of liberal states and liberal societies and dissolve it all in an immediate action by the mass. The Ortega y Gasset piece blends together several different things, some of which are more elitist concern for loss of privilege, but some of which are quite sincere fears, because the thing that liberalism strives to do and sets up institutions to do is to protect minorities. Now, those minorities include the wealthy, being protected from the great mass of society, but they also include a lot of vulnerable populations. And so Ortega y Gasset is worried about the abolition of liberal institutions and what impact it will mean for people or for groups who are different. And then we have Carl Schmitt. Schmitt is not a fan of liberalism. He is a defender in an official sense of National Socialism in Germany. And this piece is a critique of the theoretical coherence of the concept of parliamentary democracy. So Schmitt argues that the liberal parliamentary dimensions of modern governmental systems are in fundamental tension with democratic ideals. And for Schmitt, liberalism is driving toward a kind of an abstract, formal universalism that in principle can encompass all humankind, whereas democracy is driving toward substantive equality. And for Schmitt, substantive equality is always the equality of people that are relatively similar to each other. They are fairly homogeneous. And that relatively uniform population excludes, and if necessary, exterminates, eradicates other populations from its midst. So he's writing this piece to argue that there is a tension between liberalism and democracy, and he thinks that it's going to lead to democracy asserting itself, possibly in dictatorial form. Okay, so it's a very peculiar argument that there might be a closer alignment between democracy and certain kinds of dictatorship than between democracy and liberalism itself. And then topic 3 on totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, she's someone where I've both provided a podcast myself interpreting the particular reading passage that we have, and I've also included a video interview of her that is subtitled in English, so you'll have to read the subtitles, that is giving a broader sense of her work and is made by someone else. But Hannah Arendt is a classic text analyzing totalitarianism at a point where it was not necessarily intuitive that you could group together things like German fascism and Stalinist communism. These were on some level movements that opposed each other and that fought against each other. So it wasn't necessarily intuitive that you could regard them as symptoms of some similar kind of governmental form. So her analysis is important in helping to establish that there is a larger category into which these things can be grouped. And she analyzes the character of totalitarianism, what it's about, what kinds of needs that it meets, and she will link it to industrial production and to the impact that industrial production has on the kinds of activities and social bonds that people can engage in. And some of her arguments will sound familiar based on some of the things we've been reading in the last couple of weeks, some of the flashpoints in those discussions about whether particular relationships to thought, to intellectual life, to science, might predispose people to fascism, will echo through. You'll hear in her text some of the arguments that those later texts that we read last week were sort of trying to make. We have a long piece by Zygmunt Bauman that is analyzing the implications of the Holocaust for the way that we think about civilization and progress and rationality. So it runs through a variety of competing theories, how to understand what the Holocaust is, dismisses a number of them because he thinks that they don't allow us to consider the Holocaust centrally enough with reference to these core concepts. So again, it'll touch on a lot of the things we've been discussing over the last few weeks, but with specific reference to this tragedy. Francois Furet and Martin Malia are both looking at communism primarily. Furet will look at fascism as well, looking at what these systems appealed to. So Furet begins particularly interested in recapturing the moment before people knew that these movements were going to go terribly, terribly wrong and turn murderous. What was the appeal of them? For Furet, particularly to intellectuals, what was the appeal of them, and why were they as attractive as they were? What did they seem to promise? And why did it take people so long to realize that was going wrong? Malia looks at the trajectory of the Soviet Union specifically, looking at the relationship between utopian ideals and the development and the eventual collapse of the Soviet system. We've got two different passages from the book, one of which is written after the collapse and reflects back on it and the impact of it, the sort of a rapid reconfiguration of how we understood the world when the Soviet Union quite quickly crumbled. And then there's Robert Paxton, which is a quite straightforward but very interesting exploration of the difficulties in defining what fascism is and what its key characteristics are at different stages of its development. Quite straightforward, less difficult probably than the other texts in this topic, and just gives an overview of that particular system. So those are your choices for this week. We've got podcasts for several of the more difficult ones to make it easier to choose to read the more difficult ones, and then we'll come together in class and we'll talk about what these different approaches to government mean, how they interact with the classical forms of liberalism and conservatism that we've looked at in previous weeks, and how they may relate also to some things that are going on today.